think we will get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Devil's Punchbowl Plant Study Results webinar. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name is Sarah Norman, and I am the Community Outreach Coordinator for Landmark Conservancy. For those of you who are new to Landmark Conservancy, we are a nonprofit conservation organization that protects land in 20 counties in West and Northwest Wisconsin. Our main office is in Menominee, and we have another smaller office up in Bayfield. We work with private landowners as well as municipalities, state and federal entities to permanently protect land. Our primary tools for land protection are conservation easements and land acquisition. Over on the right side of your screen is what we call our dot map. Every dot represents a property that Landmark has helped to protect in our 20 county service area. So to date, Landmark has protected over 40,000 acres, including 21 nature preserves that we own and manage. Next slide, please. So the Devil's Punchbowl is one of those nature preserves that Landmark owns and manages. I'm sure many of you have been to the site and know that it's a highly visited small 3-acre preserve, and that the main attraction there is the natural rock amphitheater. So you probably walked down the stairs. Hopefully you've been there since the new stairway was installed. And then you curve around to the right and you see this beautiful rock amphitheater. So to provide you with a little bit of history, in 1961, the Devil's Punchbowl was created by deed when the town of Menominee took title. Shortly after that, it was deeded to Dunn County, and in 1990, it was conveyed to the UW-Stout Foundation. So UW-Stout has had a relationship to this property for quite some time. In 1998, the UW-Stout Foundation gifted the property to Landmark Conservancy, and we have owned it ever since. Next slide, please. So we were excited to work with Mandy Little from UW-Stout to apply for a $1,000 grant from the Natural Resources Foundation of Wisconsin. The research that will be presented tonight was funded in part by their Wisconsin Rare Plant Preservation Fund. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to introduce our main presenters. We're thrilled to have Dr. Mandy Little and Britney Serafina joining us tonight. Mandy Little has been a professor of biology at UW-Stout for 14 years and helped to develop their environmental science major. She has conducted botanical research in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Maine with a special interest in wetlands. Her favorite thing to do in summer is extended tent camping trips with her 2 toddlers in Door County, which I love, getting her little kids outside. Her favorite thing to do with students is to take them to bogs so that they can see carnivorous plants and get stuck in the peat. Britney Serafina is a 4th-year student at UW-Stout studying environmental science with a concentration in natural resource conservation and minors in plant science and geographic information systems. Along with the plant survey at the Devil's Punchbowl, they have also participated in the Red Cedar watershed monitoring research, collecting water quality data from streams, rivers, Lake Menominee, and Lake Tainter. In her free time, Britney likes to bake, cook, make jewelry, play board games, and travel. Interestingly, she went to Florida over the summer and enjoyed kayaking and manatee watching at Blue Spring State Park, one of the most breathtaking places she has been so far. They even waited in line 3 hours before it opened just to get in. So I asked them to submit something fun with their bios just to keep everybody interested here. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Mandy and Britney to present the findings of their study.
Inventory the plant species, and this includes both vascular plants, which are what we think of as bigger plants. So we were going to locate any rare species that we found and report them to Wisconsin Natural Heritage Inventory, and hopefully provide a baseline for future plant surveys so we could see whether things are disappearing from the preserve or invasive plants coming in. So we thought the Punchbowl might be a good place to look for rare plants because it has a lot of different microhabitats in it. It has everything from kind of a really dry, sandy prairie area all the way to the, wet, dripping, cool, moist cliff faces. This is kind of a unique microclimate in the sort of dry kind of agricultural lands around here. And it has been a preserve for a while with some inaccessible areas that may host rare plants that either people haven't noticed before or have not been disturbed. In addition, past surveys have located rare land snails there, the cherry stone drop snail in particular, which is a state species of concern. So we thought maybe there would be some rare plants there. So we conducted weekly surveys. Brittany and I went out every week to see what was going on. And you really need to do this. And even with that kind of intensity of survey, we're still not sure that we captured every single plant species that's there. We did moss identification in the lab, and you'll hear more about that. And then we did kind of classify our different species according to a database. WisFlora is the Wisconsin State Herbarium's website, and I highly recommend it for looking at your own different plant species that you might need confirmation of identification for. So we found a coefficient of conservatism for that, which Brittany will tell us more about. We looked at the invasive status of the plants and also whether or not they've been found in Dunn County before, which you can get off of the WisFlora database. Oops. If we had found any rare species, we would report them to this, the Natural Heritage Inventory. So you can report them. They have a web form. Any of you out there who find rare species should do that. There's a working list because they're not really sure 100% what is rare versus not. And so that's why it's called a working list. Plants can change different statuses depending on their populations, etc. So I think Brittany's going to take over now.
Yes. So we have found and recorded about 209 vascular plant species, and this is an underestimate because we more than likely did not find everything present. But for each species, I found the coefficient of conservatism, and the coefficient of conservatism was determined by using the online Virtual Flora of Wisconsin or the Michigan Flora site. And it measures how faithful a species is to their natural plant community. Value of 10 means that the species can only be found within their natural plant community and never really outside of it. So a majority of the species, well, about 22% of them, had a C of 0, which makes those species that normally gravitate towards disturbed areas or are considered invasive. Next slide, please. In this picture, you can see 5 spring ephemeral flowers, also known as mayflowers. And all of these common flowers at the Punchbowl have CFCs that range from 6 to 7. So we have some trillium, early meadow rue, bloodroot, large flowered bellwort, and spring beauty. Next slide, please. So the top 3 most conservative species have a coefficient of 9, and these are the Chrysosplenium, Polypodium, and Symphyotrichum. The next most conservative species was Coreopsis, and it was possibly seeded in the upper portion of the Devil's Punchbowl in about 2008 to 2009, so it might not be as significant of a finding. Next slide, please.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of take back over here just to kind of look at some of these cool rare species, or not, they're not rare, they're high coefficient of conservatism, right, which means that they're have that high fidelity. So this one is really cool, golden saxifrage, and it shows up in spring areas. So this is one of those ones with a CFC of 9, and I put the arrows in here kind of pointing towards areas in the Punchbowl where it occurs. And honestly, these are areas where people like to walk a lot too. Very springy areas, very sensitive to like footprints. They just kind of sink in and stuff. But it's got these really cool flowers. And I'm just gonna pull this up here. So the flowers are just so unique. They have these 8 little red stamens sticking out there. They don't really have that big of petals or anything, but it's just kind of a neat little plant. So that's that golden saxifrage. Other plants that I thought were kind of notable, the bishop's cap or mitrewort is one of those with a higher coefficient of conservatism. But there were also some plants that I just don't see around here in Dunn County very often. Northern enchanter's nightshade, this was growing on the cliffs in little like ledges and nooks. Rosy twisted stalk is one of the neater plants there. There's a big cluster of blue bead lily, which is, again, I just don't see it around very often in Dunn County. So it's really thriving in this kind of cooler microclimate. This, of course, ghost plant is one of everybody's favorite parasitic non-photosynthetic plants. It actually attaches to fungi, which are mycorrhizal, and that means they attach to the roots of trees. So it's like sucking stuff out of trees indirectly through a fungus. Isn't that cool? Okay, anyway, the other thing that I thought was pretty neat is this long-stalked sedge. And this sedge is evergreen. So you can see it's got 2 years of growth here. It's old, dark hanging leaves. And then probably sometime in May, it just flowers and produces seeds for like a few weeks. And then those go away and it produces some new growth. So it's a really neat little sedge, but if we hadn't been visiting there on a weekly basis, we would have missed its flowering time and we wouldn't have been able to tell what it was. So that's kind of the importance of going there quite frequently when you're doing these plant surveys. So about 20, are you doing this, Brittany, or am I? I think me, right? Okay. About 20% of the plants were sort of, oops, sorry. I'm trying to get rid of this screen sharing thing up on the top. All right, because I can't see my text. Okay, they're just non-native, not invasive. All right, so about 20% of the plants were non-native. And that may seem like a high number to you, but you have to think about the Punchbowl in general, right? It's only about a 3-acre preserve, and it's got a road along one side of it, a parking lot along part of it, and these trails that have a lot of high visitation, right? So this really should not be really that unexpected. In fact, in the state of Wisconsin, I think there's about, roughly 2,300 native plant species and about 800 non-native plant species. So, you know, it's really kind of a mixture. These were some of the ones that I felt were of concern down near the bottom. These are the ones that are kind of potentially invasive or actually invasive. So these are the 14 invasive plant species down here, and ones we saw in our plant survey that we kind of need to look at. And you might not think of burdock as an invasive plant, but I think they list it there because it's really problematic for bats. Bats can get stuck in burdock and they die. So anyway. And here's just a picture of the creeping bellflower. And this is one of those plants that is potentially invasive, right? They're just kind of watching it. Doesn't quite qualify as invasive yet. So what do we do about this? Well, of course, like patrols, we're going to want to do you know, eradication where we can. Brittany and I this summer pulled garlic mustard where we could find it. There was quite a bit actually down below the road, kind of above where this, if you're familiar with the Punchbowl, this little tunnel goes under the road, right? So a lot of garlic mustard coming in off of the road. And it's really important to keep doing this and pull the few individuals before they can get a foothold. So it's kind of at this stage where, you know, we really make a difference by doing that. Once the invasives take over, it's difficult to get rid of them. This is an example of a prairie sort of naturalized plant, the Deptford pink. It looks pretty, and when you see it, you're like, oh, that's cool, but it's actually not even a native flower, and we found that here in this little prairie area. So the ferns were really cool in the Punchbowl. There's actually probably 14 species. Brittany and I were going through this list of ferns and we're like, I thought we saw some sensitive fern out there, but it wasn't on our list. So I'm like, So we're probably gonna go back again next year just to add a few more species to our list. But look at all these different ferns. 14 different species, or 13 is quite high for very small preserve, and that's a function of the small moist or the cool moist microclimate, right? Ferns like those types of areas. One of the cooler ones that we found here was the bulblet fern, which produces these tiny little bulbils, reproductive structures on its leaves that can fall and make a new fern. Some other ferns, there's a lot of evergreen wood fern on site. How you identify ferns often is you look at their kind of spore structures. So if you look on the underside of this fern, you can see structures called sori. You look at those structures to identify what species they are. You can also use the leaf shape for fern identification. The polypody, you can see here, is clinging to a rock. This is a picture from the Punchbowl. This is one of the ones with the higher coefficient of conservatism. So one of the cuter ferns. Here's lady fern kind of unfurling during the year. Some of the ferns that are clinging to the cliffs and are kind of unique cliff-based ferns are this fragile fern, and of course the bulblet fern. Where I've seen the bulblet fern most often in my own personal life is on cliff faces in Door County. And there's just this one patch at the Punchbowl. So it's pretty neat. It's got these long trailing fronds. And there's also some northern beech fern there, which has kind of a unique structure. And one of my favorites, the rattlesnake fern, which has this little like rattlesnake tail sticking up with the spores on it. And then I just thought these pictures were pretty. Maiden hair fern and the interrupted fern. They're just beautiful pictures. And Brittany took about half the pictures and I took the other half. So the good ones are taken by Brittany. Some of our neat finds included club mosses. Now, club mosses are not really mosses. They're typically limited to undisturbed woodland areas. So once you get any kind of grazing in there or a lot of heavy logging, they disappear. They're fairly uncommon. I haven't seen them around too often in Dunn County. There's one kind of version that I've seen more often out at Hoffman Hills, but none of these. These were located on the very steep north-facing cliffs at the Punchbowl where nobody goes. And they're kind of limited to only a few individuals. So like this cluster of shining club moss here, this is pretty much all there was. And you can see the arrows pointing to some structures that are called sporangia, which are these little yellow sacs that contain spores. So that's pretty fun. But we did find some bristly club moss, and you could see by this map here, this map is from the Wisflora website. This hasn't really been documented in Dunn County before, and it's sort of on the edge of its range if you look at that state distribution map. And this was the only individual on the site, this one. Then we found some northern tree club moss, again, not really documented in Dunn County before. And there were very few of these individuals as well. So this brings up the question, these are not considered rare species in the state of Wisconsin, right? There's a few individuals here in the Punchbowl. What do we do about it? Do we put a little fence up around them? Do we bring in some, potential mates for them so that they can have baby club mosses more easily? What do you do about these plants that are just kind of in small population sizes and preserves? The blue bead lily over here, there's one big cluster of it in the punch bowl that could be easily destroyed by people trampling on it. So they're interesting kind of philosophical questions associated with this, and kind of probably we'll just kind of wait and see what happens, right? So in terms of the different plant communities that were found at the Punch Bowl, there's a wide variety, but there's a mixture of northern and southern forests. And this should be expected because in Wisconsin, we sort of have a border between ecological provinces where you have northern hardwoods and southern hardwoods. And there's this line that's called the tension zone. It's climatically caused. And so you can see it kind of runs through Dunn County. So expect in Wisconsin a mixture here of these two. And so I put a little star by some of the prairie habitats here. These their representation here at the Punch Bowl in part may be due to some seeding that happened. There's by the parking lot. They did do a little small prairie restoration there. All right, so Brittany's going to talk about some moss identification.
So when we did our moss identification, there was a few characteristics that we looked at. One of them was whether or not they were acrocarps or pleurocarps, and those are the two major forms of growth in mosses. An acrocarp has simple stems. They have capsules arising from the stem tip and are typically upright, where pleurocarps have stems that branch freely, have capsules that arise mid-stem, and are typically trailing around the ground. The diagram at the bottom gives a pretty good visual about the key differences between them. And then we also looked at the general leaf shape. We would differentiate between the common lance-like and ovate leaves. And more uncommon leaf shapes that we did come into contact with were hair-like, sickle, and tongue-shaped leaves. The ones at the moss on the top left shows more of a lance-like leaf shape, and the one on the bottom right shows more of an ovate leaf shape. So it's very easy to sometimes it's easy to distinguish. Sometimes we had a pretty hard time. It's the fine line. And then we also looked at the midrib. We would determine whether or not there was a midrib present. It's the vein down the middle of the leaf. It's sometimes very faint or very prominent, and sometimes it's not even there at all. And the moss in the bottom right image shows a pretty prominent midrib. And then we would also have to look at mosses both wet and dry. We learned this the hard way after not leaving a piece of moss dry, because we learned as we were identifying that mosses can have both different looks when they're wet and dry. So a good example of this is atrichum. When dry, it looks very contorted. However, once it rehydrates, it unfurls and has a completely different look to it. And that is atrichum, where Mandy is pointing. And then the last key characteristic is cellular structure. Next slide, please. These are some of the pictures of moss underneath our dissecting scope. You can see the capsule on the left, it's kind of green and curved, and then the capsules on the bottom right are brown and straight. So capsules were also pretty useful in identification because they can vary greatly with color and shape. And then the moss guide we used the most for identification is on the right. It's the common mosses of the Northeast and Appalachians. Next slide, please. Microhabitats are very important to mosses because mosses depend heavily on the community type, and some can be very particular into where they grow. Next slide, please. The three most common moss community types were rotten logs and stumps, disturbed areas, and wet rocks. And among all of these moss communities that we found, 3 community types require the presence of water, whether it was like dripping a little bit or seeping wet with water. And this is why microhabitats are important to mosses, because different mosses are able to grow on tree bases, but the same mosses might not be able to grow on tree bark. And it's just very important in keys as well, because sometimes they'll ask if the moss was present on a rock or on a tree or in soil. Next slide.
Unmute myself. What did we find here for our bryophytes? So these aren't a moss, but they're kind of in the same group of mosses. They don't have any vascular conducting tissue, right? They don't have any, if you're a plant nerd like me, a xylem or phloem in them. So they have to live close to the ground. So the one very, very common thing that you see at the Punchbowl all over the sandstone walls is this snakeskin liverwort. And I thought there was going to be all different types of liverworts there, but it's mostly this one, which is the snakeskin liverwort. It looks kind of dark green this time of year. In the early spring, it starts kind of producing some new leafy structures on it. And this is a picture that was taken in the early spring. These are its reproductive structures. And this was kind of located up near the top of the waterfall on the little path. They look like little mushrooms, but they're actually coming out of the liverwort. So the snakeskin liverwort is also pretty sweet because if you kind of break it open and sniff it, it smells very kind of sweet and fresh. So that's one of the, it's also called scented liverwort. So that's kind of fun. There's a few leafy liverworts there too. The liverworts fall into two big categories, the thalloid liverworts, which is what you just saw, and then these leafy liverworts, which are pretty small. There's tons of them. I checked out a book from the library that was like liverworts of the United Kingdom, and there's like, I don't know, 500 of them or something, and they all look the same. So a few that we found kind of crawling around in mosses includes this one, and they're just called leafy liverwort. They don't even have a common name. There's this really sweet one though that grows around the trees, and it looks like a little skirt, like a little fringe skirt, and I found it in one location in the Punchbowl. It's just a really neat structure, and the liverworts kind of come off kind of in a single plane. It's called two-ranked, kind of side by side, whereas the mosses kind of curl around, have leaves all the way around their stems. So the waterfall and the seeping cliff faces, of course, are really great places for mosses. So the moss that was in the waterfall is part of a kind of a big complex called Brachythecium, kind of a foxtail moss. The taxonomy is very confused, and there's a big cluster of these species, but that's what this kind of darker moss is. Another moss that's on the waterfall is this one, which I think is totally beautiful. The bleached seep moss is kind of a brighter, kind of almost sea green color. Of course, Brittany and I were surprised. We're like, what is that weird thing? And then we look closer, we're like, it's duckweed growing on the waterfall. So anyway, we thought that was pretty fun. Not a moss. Some other kind of common mosses that are easy to identify include this haircap moss, Polytrichum, which is one of the stiffer mosses. It looks like tiny little Christmas trees almost. Palm tree moss. Isn't this a fun one? It's one of the larger mosses that we found in kind of a small area at the Punchbowl. And then some very ferny mosses that are called a feather or a fern moss. And then Brittany and I both agree that one of our favorite mosses is this one, the apple moss, Bartramia, and it was found kind of in these big pillowy clumps on the north facing cliffs, and it has these cool little ball-like capsules on it. So we just thought this was our favorite moss. Here's some other common mosses there. The starburst moss, which Brittany was talking about being like really curly when it's dried. And then this tooth moss, which has these kind of larger leaves that you can see pretty well with your naked eye, kind of creeps around in the Punchbowl. So I think, Brittany, you're going to take over here.
Yes, ma'am. So Mandy's kind of talked about this a little bit about why are there no rare plants, but I'll go over it. more. But since the Devil's Punchbowl is only 3 acres, it is pretty unlikely to have a rare plant in like such a small preserve. It's also heavily visited and fairly unregulated, so human disturbance has like a large role in the absence of the rare plants. And when people walk with off the main trails, there's a lot of vegetation trampling, and along with that, like the Devil's Punchbowl also has unstable sandstone, where in large storm events, pieces erode and trees fall, making the area a common place of disturbance. And we actually saw this over the course of the summer. We went to the Devil's Punch Bowl one day. We were like, oh, was that tree there? I don't think so. It was just really cool to see this actively happen. But next slide, please. To further protect the Devil's Punch Bowl, we should encourage people to stay on the main trails and keep kids from climbing up the sides. And I recommend that new fences should be installed so to prevent people from going under or over them. And it would also help protect the soil and rock from further erosion. And then in the future, we should complete invasive species scouting and removal, along with future plant surveys that should occur every 5 to 10 years to assess species loss. Next slide.
All right. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, we didn't find any that are like natural heritage inventory plants, right? But we did find some really cool plants still. And the Devil's Punch Bowl still has a lot of preservation value because it's sort of like this island oasis in the middle of ag land. This is a picture that I took here, and I thought it would be neat. I'm standing at the waterfall looking back, and we sort of had this opportunity this summer where nobody was walking in the Punch Bowl because the stairs were out. I mean, I'm sure there were still the high school students like drinking on occasion, but I took this picture because I thought it would be cool to take another picture the same time next year and kind of compare, because I think the plants just really took over and flourished when there weren't people walking all over the bottom of the slopes here. So we'll see how it looks next year. So yeah, we wanted to thank like the Landmark Conservancy and the Natural Resources Foundation, the biology department, which we used, a lot of the equipment of them. And then Joe Rohrer helped us immensely because both Brittany and I were novices at this bryophyte moss identification, and a lot of the mosses look very similar to each other. So he came over, he was one of the authors of that book we recommended, and he confirmed some of our IDs and changed some of our IDs. So it was very helpful.
Okay, so well, first of all, thank you, Mandy and Brittany. On a day like today where it's been raining all day, we just went through the time change. Like I could look at your pictures of green plants, biophytes, and mosses like all night.
Me too. I was looking at them and I'm like, yellow, green, I need it.
Yeah, my soul is just like, thank you. But okay, I've just greatly enjoyed hearing all about this. And I love so much like how many people joined us tonight too. Like these are our people, who want to listen to a presentation all about plants. And we all know that the Devil's Punch Bowl is, yeah, right. We all know that the Punch Bowl is like really loved, but it's really great for Landmark as a nonprofit who specializes in land protection to be able to partner with you and Brittany, people who have that expertise and can lend the knowledge. And how cool is it that you guys got to be out there all summer when the preserve was closed? Like nobody else has ever had the opportunity to have such intimate experiences, with the site. So yeah, very cool.
It was pretty fun. I really enjoyed it too. I definitely looked forward to going out there each time I was able to get out.
Thank you to everyone for taking the time to be here and to hear about the fascinating research that Mandy and Brittany did. And thank you to Mandy and Brittany. Well, everyone, I hope you have an amazing afternoon and or evening, and we'll hope to see you soon.